Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on the FDA's Voluntary Labeling Guidelines for Genetically Engineered Products. I'm welcome today with our speaker, Dr. Bob Strong. My name is Holly, and I'll be the moderator for today. So Dr. Bob's one of our senior consultants and lead trainers with the Training and Improvement Solutions part of our business. He's got a wealth of information, over 45 years of experience in the food industry across a number of different sizes and shapes of organizations. He is a requested speaker and a trainer in lots of areas, including GMP, HACCP, the preventive controls, rules, a number of other topics. And he's, as I say, a wealth of information. Very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Bob. I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Holly. We're going to start off and just get a feel for the people who are on the call today and answering the question here, Holly.
Yeah, perfect. So would your company be willing to do a voluntary GMO labeling? This is the topic we'll talk about today. So let's get a pulse for kind of why you're here and what you're keen to learn about. So pretty straightforward, yes or no, not right now, just kind of looking to learn. So I'll leave it open for a few seconds here. And we'll close and share in about 5 seconds. Great, thanks everyone. So let me close and share the results. So kind of split down the middle. Yes, they would be willing, 43%, followed by 57%. Nope, not right now.
All right, well, hopefully that'll still be the same percentage at the end of what I'm going to present. The reason why we're doing this is because you may have missed the fact that the FDA just issued new voluntary guidelines, and we'll talk about that they did issue some a couple of years ago, but they just updated them. And these are voluntary guidelines, but we wanted to go over with you what's in them so you can see what you would have to do if you do decide that you want to label your product that it is being genetically modified. So we're going to do an overview of the guidelines. We're going to talk about some definitions and use cases for labeling of what the FDA would find acceptable and what they wouldn't. And we're also going to talk about the fact that the FDA is going to require you to have proof if you're going to make a claim, whether you're making a claim that you are GMO or non-GMO, you're going to have proof. But remember, it's voluntary right now, so you don't have to do anything, and you may want to still sit on the fence. So let's talk about an overview of this new FDA guidance. And look how we compare with the rest of the world. And obviously, we don't require it. We haven't required it, and we still don't require people to indicate on their products or ingredients whether they're GMO or not. But if you look at large sections of the world, it is required by law. And that's why we've shaded in for you here what it is required, even if you're only down to 0.9 to 1%, where you have to do it if you're over 1%, and we've left areas where you can see it is not required at all. So we are actually, when you compare us with mainly Europe and everything, we are falling behind with regard to if the public wants to know. And the question is, does the public want to know? So they originally issued the guidelines, and when you get a copy of this, we're giving you a link to the actual guidance document, so you'll be able to open that up when you get the slides. They were originally issued in November 2015, and they were just revised in March of 2019. So that's why we felt it would be timely for us to indicate to you what these voluntary guidelines say. And as we know, sometimes voluntary over a period of years changes to mandatory, but right now it's still voluntary. So in July of 2016, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard was signed into law. So that is a law. And the USDA was then charged with developing a national mandatory standard for developing the presence of bioengineered material in human food, in other words, GMO. Well, the USDA hasn't come out with any yet. So the FDA is issuing guidelines now based on labeling, because the FDA is responsible for labels on food, but the USDA is actually responsible for GMO. And you say, how come that's true? Well, the USDA is responsible for anything to do with plant and animal, and the FDA is responsible for all foods when they're labeled and in the marketplace. So therefore, this is where they're drawing the distinction, and you'll notice that the FDA is going to start using bioengineered and not using the terms GMO. So the FDA does not use the terms GMO or non-GMO as they apply to plants because, as they said, this is because foods are derived from genetically engineered plants, and plants come under the USDA's jurisdiction. This wouldn't obviously be a problem in most other countries when we only have one federal agency controlling food. But seeing we have two, we start getting into these jurisdictional things. So the FDA is trying to put out guidelines on human food and animal feeds on what you can and cannot say and where they would have a problem and where they wouldn't have a problem if you're going to make a claim for or against being bioengineered. And they're using the word bioengineered. What they point out to you immediately is if you're going to make any claims at all, whether that you're non-GMO or you are GMO, then they need to be truthful and not misleading. And we'll see later that you have to have proof to back up your claim that you are GMO or that you're not GMO. So let's talk about some labeling definitions. And these all come from these guidelines. So these are things that you'll be able to read for yourself as you go through the guidelines. And the FDA said they will allow labels that are truthful and can be proven. So again, we keep getting into they got to be truthful and they got to be proven. You got to have proof. And so therefore you could say things like not bioengineered, not genetically engineered, not genetically engineered through the use of modern biotechnology. We do not use ingredients that were produced using modern biotechnology. You could say that. Or this oil is made from soybeans that were not genetically engineered. Or you could say our corn growers do not plant bioengineered seeds. Now you can say those, but you're going to have to make sure that what you're saying is truthful and what you're saying is also something you can prove. And we'll talk in a minute about how difficult that may be to prove it. The FDA will not take enforcement action if the labels say GMO. So even though bioengineer is the term that the FDA prefers, GMO, they won't say you can't say that, or not GMO, or you say not genetically modified, or GMO free, or GE free, or does not contain GMOs. However, these statements may be difficult for you as a manufacturer to prove, particularly when you say free. Because when you say free, that means nothing in there can be genetically modified or bioengineered. And if you can't prove that, then basically what it's saying to you, don't say it if you can't prove it. That's what makes it difficult to decide if you're going to do it, and if you are going to do it, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. So they've said that statements like genetically engineered will be acceptable. Or this product contains cornmeal from corn that was produced using modern biotechnology. Or some of our growers plant soybean seeds that were developed through modern biotechnology to be drought tolerant. And so therefore, again, what they're saying is that maybe the growers are also using soybean seeds that are not biotechnology modified. Now remember, GMO stands for genetically modified, where O stands for organism. And very few products contain entire organisms. Yogurt is one, maybe an exception that the FDA makes note of in their guidelines. This could imply that the whole food was derived from genetically engineered organisms and would therefore be misbranded as being false or misleading if other ingredients in this food were not bioengineered and were not identified as such. So when you say your product is GMO or non-GMO, it better be true for everything in there, because you're not saying individual ingredients are GMO. If you want to do that, then that would make it specific, but you couldn't say it just for your food. And the FDA is saying they will take action against these mislabeled foods. So therefore, you have to obviously go through all your ingredients and decide if they are modified or not. And if they are, to make sure that everybody understands which ingredients are modified and which ones are not. So statements must remain transparent and accurate. And these are words, again, that they use. And therefore, we'll give you some more mislabeling examples. And this one is just a little cartoon thing, but it obviously indicates fish. and there's smoked trout, and there's cod, and then below is whatever. And that's obviously gets us into some of the food fraud things, which are a separate regulation, as you know, that's coming out. So let's talk about what it implies. You say none of the ingredients in this food are genetically engineered. Okay, that's a very broad statement. That means everything shouldn't be genetically engineered. But by saying that, you're indicating that some of the items, ingredients, could be bioengineered. And that's not true. For instance, if you had salt in your product, it couldn't be bioengineered. So therefore, the statement, none of the ingredients in this food are genetically engineered, would be an inaccurate statement, and hence would be a mislabeled food. And where FDA's jurisdiction is, when you have mislabeled food, the FDA has a right to tell you to withdraw the product from the marketplace. And I use the word withdraw because it may not be a health hazard, but it is not accurately labeled, therefore it's a mislabeled food. Now, some of the other things they talk about, you can't say your food is more nutritious or safer because it is not genetically engineered. So therefore making a claim that we didn't genetically engineer our product, and because of that it's more nutritious than if we had. That most certainly would not be true. And if it was true, you'd have to prove it, or you're going to have to pull that product out of the marketplace. An ingredient statement that has after or before an ingredient, the words pure, fresh, certified non-genetically engineered, violates FDA's regulations. So therefore you couldn't say it in the ingredient statement. If you want to say it in other parts of the label, that would be okay, as long as you have proof. So therefore, even when you're going to make the statement, you have to be careful where you say it. Saying it in the ingredient statement brings upon it a lot more proof, and the fact that some of those things would not be true. And if it's on other parts of the label, you can do it, but again, you're going to have to prove it's true. And maybe you can see why people are now voluntarily stepping up to list their products as GMO or non-GMO. Goes on to say, if a bioengineered ingredient composition differs from the non-bioengineered ingredient, then using the common name would be inaccurate. So therefore, if you were to take something like the example they give, if oil from a genetically modified plant has a significant different amount of lauric acid, such that the fatty acid composition is significantly changed versus the conventionally produced oil, then the standard name would no longer apply, because you genetically modified it and it isn't the same as the non-genetically modified, and therefore you couldn't talk about the lauric acid in there because it would most probably not be lauric acid anymore. So again, be careful that you are going to have a lot of information from your suppliers on what they're doing and whether it has changed the composition of something to where it no longer can be named the way it would have been if it hadn't been bioengineered. Goes on to say, if the functionality of the bioengineered ingredient differs from that of the non-bioengineered ingredient, then this must be disclosed on the label. So now if it has a different functional property, maybe it absorbs more, maybe it's a better binder, maybe it has some properties that the non-bioengineered ingredient had, then you have to say that on the label. If by bioengineering something, the vitamin content, let's say B12 is lost, then you must say that, because people may have been relying on that ingredient for their vitamin B12. And now it's not there, but unless you said it was not there, they would assume it's there. If you, for some reason, you've now got an allergen in there, for some reason when you were bioengineering it, you were attaching it to an allergen as a carrier or something, then again, you have to be careful. You make sure that you're saying that on the label. If a food or feed manufacturer makes claims that their foods and ingredients are either bioengineered or not, has to have proof. So we keep coming back to proof, proof, proof. If you're going to make a claim for or a claim that you're not GMO or bioengineered. Hence, you've got to make a decision if you're going to do the labeling, and 43% of you said that you would be willing to voluntarily do it. But now, for that 43%, you have to decide whether you're going to make those claims or not. Because if you're going to make the claims, then you're going to have proof that what you're saying is true. And you've got to also decide how you're going to say it so that you don't violate the FDA's labeling laws. So therefore, sometimes you're going to make the claim on the label, but not in the ingredient statement. And sometimes you're going to make it in the ingredient statement, but then you're going to have proof. And you're going to have to be sure it didn't change the properties or lose vitamins or introduce allergens or anything that would make it different to the non-bioengineered. And then if you're going to claim it's not bioengineered altogether, you can't say that if some of the ingredients couldn't be bioengineered if you tried, like salt. Then you would have to make a thing of which of the ingredients has been bioengineered. Now, if you are integrated all the way from the farm all the way to retail, then everything that you do, you have control over. And therefore, you know exactly how things are grown. You know the type of seeds that you used. You know exactly what was put in the ground. You know what was taken out of the ground. You know how it was processed into ingredients. You know how the ingredient was processed into a product. Then clearly you're going to have all of the information you need to be able to prove that it is bioengineered or it is not bioengineered. But if you're just a distributor or you're using somebody else's ingredient, then you're going to have to go get this information from the grower and the processor in order to be able to support your claims. And then you're going to have to hope that they are going to be totally willing to give you that information and it's going to be totally accurate. And therefore, when you make claims on your product, then you can support it with records that prove that the claims you're making for or against GMO are therefore factual and provable, and therefore there should be no problems with that product being mislabeled and the FDA taking action and asking you to pull your product out of the marketplace. When you look at what the public wants, and this is a survey, and we've got the reference at the bottom here, you can see it says 91% of Americans want GMOs labeled. And goes on to say that 1 million sets a record for comments on a food petition submitted to the FDA. So they got over 1 million submissions of questions or comments. Says if you go try and do it just against politics, 89% Republicans say they want to label, 93% of Democrats. So clearly, the public is interested in whether this product is GMO or non-GMO. And yet there is no mandatory requirements for you to say that. And there's very few labels in America that say that. And yet you go to other countries, it does say that. And remember that when we talk about the labeling, it is not just on products made in the USA for consumption in the USA. The FDA is saying any product coming into the America under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is going to have to meet the same requirements as any product made in the USA. So therefore, for Canadian manufacturers or English manufacturers, they're going to have to meet these guidelines, and they're voluntary, so therefore they can choose to label or not label. And it obviously, right now, pretty well every manufacturer is choosing not to label because of the fact that you have to have all that proof, etc. So Holly, did you get any questions from people?
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Bob. Yeah, lots of questions here in the short time that we did that. Yeah, so the terminology non-GMO will be allowed on food labels, or are we now restricted to only bioengineered or made with bioengineered ingredients?
Well, the FDA said in part of their voluntary guidelines to us all that they will not react if you say GMO and non-GMO, even though the FDA prefers bioengineered, and GMO would be a term used by USDA. but they say they will not react to that if you want to use GMO and non-GMO. And I think actually if we start saying bioengineered, I'm not sure the public would understand what that means.
Yeah, okay. How do you think globalization will drive regulatory compliance in the US? Other areas of the world seem to be ahead of us. How will this start to change in the US?
Well, change because the public will start pressuring the FDA to move forward and make it mandatory that you have to identify what ingredients in products are GMO, and therefore the public would say we have a right to know, and you as a regulator may need to provide us with that information. There hasn't been that movement, obviously, to pressure it to go into mandatory. There obviously is some pressure coming that the public is asking for it, and the FDA is taking that gentle step of saying voluntary. But I think myself, I would say over the next few years, you're going to see the voluntary start to become mandatory. Where the big challenge is going to become then is how are you going to prove it? What type of proof do you need to have? Where's those studies coming from? And what would the FDA accept and not accept? And how expert are they on determining that the functionality has changed, or that it is something that is different enough that you have to tell the public? And I think that's one of the problems. I'm not sure the FDA is prepared to make it mandatory, because then they would have to regulate it and inspect against it.
Yeah, and naturally, that is the next question: is when are these voluntary guidelines effective, and how do they compare against the USDA bioengineered standard?
Well, they're in effect now. They've been in effect for a couple of years, and all the FDA has done is tried to give more clarification on what the guidelines, voluntary guidelines are, to try to stop people making claims they can't prove, whether it's that our product isn't genetically modified or making claims that it is genetically modified. I think the FDA is trying to say to you, be careful if you're going to take that step, that we are going to react if you say things you can't say or you don't have proof. And I think, therefore, I would say that right now they're saying, gee, if you want to do it, go ahead and do it, but these are the rules. Now, the voluntary rules, so we're not saying you have to do it. And when they say you're going to have to do it, I think it's going to be a tremendous change in our food supply with regard to labeling.
Yeah, certainly. One of our participants made the comment exactly to that point: is once it becomes mandatory, then it'll act like recalls. Then we'll actually damage brands. But right now, since it's mandatory, the sort of potential risk against the brand is perceived as to be a little bit lower. Which is a good point. It's a good point. How are GMOs linked to public health negatively?
Well, I think that's one of the problems. I'm not sure we have in the evidence. You know, you get into the fact that people feel that if you genetically modify something, it may have health concerns. It may take 20 or 30 years of eating the product to have problems. And we have a right to know that you're doing it. But I'm not sure that there's a detrimental effect to it. And you can get into the philosophical argument is that if we don't do it, then we won't be able to keep feeding the millions and millions of people in the world that is increasing at a rapid rate. That if we don't have genetically modified crops that are drought resistant and insect resistant and those things, then we're going to finish up with a lot of people starving in the world and dying. So you have to balance that against the fact is, what do you know about long-term effects of eating these GMO modified products? And I'll leave that to other people to argue for or against, but clearly that's some people's concern. But I don't think they have the proof that what they think is actually going to happen to them, and they're going to have some type of a deadly disease, or they're going to die 10 years earlier than they would have done if they hadn't had GMO food. But again, I'm not taking a stand either side on that.
Okay. What is a supplier's and not a retail product manufacturer obligation? So what is a supplier's obligation, not a retail product manufacturer, regarding record keeping and disclosure for bioengineered ingredients when we purchase raw materials from suppliers and only have their statements for proof?
Well, that's the point. It's the same as doing hazards in your food safety plan or your hazard plan. You have to know what your hazards are, and you have to know exactly what it takes to the probability they're going to be there and the severity if they are there, and you have to have proof for that. So it's just adding another thing where you're going to have proof. And you're going to have a little difficulty being able to challenge the proof if it's given to you. And you know some people are going to give you stuff that is not true simply because there are people out there who do that now, and they do it under food fraud and other things. So I think I think that's going to open up a hornet's nest on exactly how do I know what I'm given is true, and then I start putting it on my label, and now it's my product with my label, and now the FDA comes after me to recall it. But I did it in good faith based on what I was told by the farmer, or told by the broker, or told by whoever's supplying me with the ingredient. And so I'm not an expert myself as a manufacturer of this product, so I believe them and I put it on my label, but now you make me pull my label. And so that's where you get into the fact that while it's voluntary right now, my personal stand is I wouldn't do anything because you're going to have proof that'll stand up to the test when the regulator starts questioning it.
Yeah, all good points. Can you just clarify the difference between genetically modified organisms, so GMO, versus genetically engineered?
Well, the reason they're using the word engineered is because the FDA can use that word, whereas the USDA uses the word genetically modified. They are the same. Bioengineered is actually the word. Genetically bioengineered or genetically modified. They are the same terms, except the FDA is keeping away from using a term that the USDA has approval to use.
Yep. Can you clarify, does the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard from the USDA apply to all food manufacturers, so USDA and FDA?
Well, that's why they asked the USDA to decide. They asked the USDA to decide what is genetically modified or what is genetically bioengineered, and then to come up with guidelines and to come up with what you would have to put on the product and what you would have to have in the way of proof. And I think what it needs to do, I think the FDA and the USDA need to sit down together and decide, is this going anywhere? And every time it gets prodded a little, just like now in March of this year, when FDA prods it again with reissuing the voluntary guidelines, I'm not sure it moves us forward, but it just prods everybody into it. And I think basically what the FDA is saying is be careful what you put on your label, because then we have to act. If you don't put it on your label, we don't have to act.
Yep, okay. Does the guidance address what testing is needed to prove the product is not derived from a GM source?
Now you're getting beyond my technical capability, so I would say I have to defer to the fact that I would not know what type of test you can do, but I'm sure there are tests that can be done to show that things are being modified.
Yeah, the question is, do you happen to know if the guidance document addresses what the requirement or what suggestions for testing?
No.
No, okay, all right.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Let me see here. How does it compare against the EU standards, the European Union?
I haven't compared that with the EU standard, and as you can see, the European Union was big into it. If you look also, Australia was big into it. And so we can possibly get answers from our European colleagues at SAI Global. And we could also maybe get answers from our colleagues in Australia, because we are based in both those countries and have a lot of business. And they may be much better in telling you how they've addressed it in their various countries. So maybe that's a follow-up that we need to do.
All right. Salt was mentioned as a potentially, genetically modified ingredient. However, I do not see this on the list of food ingredients that could be genetically modified. Could you please advise on this?
So read that again from the beginning.
Yeah, sure. Salt was mentioned as a potentially genetically modified ingredient. You alluded to earlier that if you're listing everything on the label is not from a genetically modified source, be careful if something is potentially capable of being modified. This is what this question is asking about. So salt was mentioned as a potentially genetically modified ingredient. However, I do not see this on the list of food ingredients that could be genetically modified. Can you just comment on
No,
that?
no, I misspoke or you misread what I said. No, salt cannot be genetically modified. So the comment the FDA was saying, you can't say that your product does not contain any bioengineered ingredients as a general statement, including everything when you got salt in there, because it couldn't be bioengineered anyway. So that's when you have to get into specifically saying which ingredient is bioengineered. And also, if you're not going to say non-GMO or bioengineered, you also have to understand you can't say that as a general statement either, unless you're specific, because not everything can be bioengineered, and salt was one of them. I'm sure there's lots of other ingredients that would not be able to be bioengineered, because you get back to plants and you get back to animals. And the USDA guidelines do talk about things. You can also bioengineer bacteria, and there's several other things that are mentioned, but they're generally a plant and animal.
Okay. Does the guidance address cross-contamination?
No, it doesn't, but that would be a concern, obviously, and that's why I think one of the problems that's happened, and I think this was an issue in Canada a few years ago where they had some farmers who were basically planting genetically modified seeds, and then the seeds would grow, and then they would maybe flower in some cases, and the wind would carry them over into another field, and the other field could be 3 or 4 or 5 miles away, and they would therefore seed in that field, and this would cause a problem with regard to the fact that that farmer couldn't claim that he was non-GMO when he had another farmer who was 5 miles away upwind, and he was downwind. And so these are the interesting questions that I've seen bounced around over the last 10 years or so, and I think that I read that one in Canada about a lot of the wheat and et cetera being grown up there. Can you really prove it when you're 5 miles or so downwind from somebody who's actually using GMO seeds and spreading them on the fields?
Interesting. How does this fit in with a vulnerability assessment? If our suppliers are supplying ingredients and they claim it's non-GMO and we find out this to be false, does this present a risk that we should have captured in our VASIP?
Yes, it actually wouldn't be in your HACCP, but it would be in your labeling claims. So the answer would be yes. And therefore, you need to know more about your suppliers. And we learn that every day now. You almost have to have a really good relationship with your suppliers where you know as much as they know about what they do in their plants and with regard to any type of thing, whether it's a hazard or whether they're genetically bioengineered, etc. And so it's been difficult for suppliers of ingredients to try and keep stuff confidential these days when they have to share so much with their customers and then hope that their customers don't then share it with other suppliers. And so you get into that world of how much can I tell you and still protect what is confidential. And so it's going to be interesting.
Indeed. Okay. I'm not sure I understand this question, but I'll read it and hopefully you understand, Dr. Bob. If GMO is the cause of diseases, why FDA accept this? Why would the FDA accept this?
Well, I don't know that we know it's a cause of illnesses, and I think that's one of the problems. I think that the public has got a lot more information these days about foods and how they're grown and how we do things. And with that, it raises some concerns about, well, do we know enough about what we're doing? Are we going to create some problems later on in our lives? And you can move over into vaccines and you can move over into a lot of stuff that we've done for years. And there's a lot of people for and against. And people start then linking things into things and say, well, this was caused because we did this. In other words, there are some people who feel we shouldn't mess with Mother Nature. And so the question is that a true feeling, meaning it's scientifically based? Or is that just, I don't like you messing with anything because I don't know what the long-term effects are? I haven't seen anything that tells me that genetically modified things have actually caused people to get serious illnesses or shorten their lives or anything. I do know the upsides are that we're able to grow crops with better yields that don't get affected by droughts and don't get affected by insects or rust or any of the other things that attack our crops, and allows us to get more crops to market and feed the world's population. And I'm not saying that that's the reason that you justify doing things simply because there's an upside. You have to look at the downside. I'm not sure what the downside is personally.
Okay. Do you feel as if the FDA would accept an ingredient statement that calls out a genetically engineered or bioengineered material with a symbol? The symbol would then refer to a statement, similar to how we label or call out organic ingredients.
That's a good question. And remember, the FDA is much more cooperative now in taking questions, and they have websites now where you can submit questions and they'll answer it. And you can see from that slide that we had a minute ago about the fact that the FDA got 1 million comments. So what happens when they get comments, they have to respond to those comments. So there's going to be a point at which these comments are going to come out and they're going to answer all those questions that have been answered. The point is, will that answer the question that you said? Can I put a little asterisk or an icon next to it and then explain later on the label somewhere that what has happened or hasn't happened to that ingredient? And I would think, yes, that's going to be some of the things that are going to have to be resolved, particularly if it moves from voluntary to mandatory. And I think that's going to be the big decision by the FDA. How do you make it mandatory if you can't clearly say to people what they have to have on the label, how it has to be on the label? And we're going through the thing that right now, if you notice, there is no legal definition for natural. And the FDA is now trying to get comments on what you mean by natural, and they're going to formulate what natural will be. And then when they put that out, you'll only be able to use the word natural if it fits in with the criteria they list. We also know that they're looking at sell by, use by, and best by dates. So what the FDA is trying to do is tidy up some things that are a little vague right now and don't have clear definitions and certainly don't have legal definitions, so therefore can be challenged by lawyers. And I think this GMO thing is falling into the same thing. If you don't give everybody a lot of guidance on what to do, then we're going to have labels all over the place, which will make it confusing to the public who say, I have a right to know. I don't know what people are going to do, actually, if they say, I don't want to eat any products with GMO ingredients in there, because I'm not sure that you're going to find too many products that don't have GMO ingredients in there now. And therefore, we may finish up, there's almost very few things you can eat when we find out how many products already have genetically bioengineered ingredients in them now that we've been eating for years.
Yeah, okay. Bioengineered disclosure and labeling is mandatory, while FDA is voluntary. FDA is voluntary for labeling for genetically engineered. As a food manufacturer, which one should we follow? I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, it's not mandatory because the USDA hasn't even issued what they would require, and they're going to be the ones who are going to decide exactly what is genetically modified, what is genetically bioengineered. And then FDA is going to say how you have to put that on the label. And I think it's a little like the chicken and the egg, which comes first. Well, I think obviously it comes first that the USDA has to decide what is genetically modified organisms, and then the FDA has to say how that should be on the label. The FDA is trying to get, I think, ahead of the game here, saying, well, if you're going to start labeling it, let's tell you right now what we'll accept and what we won't. And so if you want to start doing it, then go ahead and do it. But if you're going to mislabel it according to the FDA's labeling regulations, then we're going to tell you to pull your product off the marketplace, because we're going to tell you it's not factual, or it's misleading, or you can't use those words, because FDA has the jurisdiction over label product that's out in the marketplace.
Indeed. Okay, very good. Those are all of our questions. Dr. Bob, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. I'll remind everyone we've recorded the session, so we'll send that out within a business day. And thanks very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Holly.